mean, the obvious thing that we need to start addressing is this whole trauma thing. And people are like, what? 24 different traumas in 19 years of missionary work.
So as things began to happen, I realized that, if I'm honest with myself, being in the center of God's will may be the best place to be, but it is not the safest place to be. And when I look...
Hey, y'all. This is Dr. Chris Sargent, and welcome to the Spark Faith Podcast. I have an amazing guest today. Y'all are going to be so floored, and I know I say that an awful lot. Karen Bettison wrote this book called I Will Fear No Evil. And y'all, she has been through 24 named traumatic events on top of so much more. I don't even know how many times she's been ill as a missionary in Africa for 19 years. This book was a total page turner. I did not anticipate it. And Karen, I don't think you anticipated people saying that about you either. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Oh my gosh, it's so exciting. Thanks for reaching out. I'm glad to have it. I'm so happy to have you here. So the obvious thing that we need to start addressing is this whole trauma thing. And people are like, what? 24 different traumas in 19 years of missionary work. And I don't think that we think about missionaries like that. Like, I think we think of them as being in a bubble and probably safe because they're missionaries to some extent. But that is not your story at all.
Right.
Not your story at all. Go ahead.
Yeah. So, that is really one of the main themes of my book was that, I went to the mission field just like many missionaries do, with a lot of zeal and enthusiasm and excited about, sharing the Great Commission with the lost. And I went that way. And then as traumas began to unfold and I began to see how the life in that part of the world was very difficult for not just us, but for the people that live there. I began, questioning my beliefs and things that I had been raised to believe. And I don't know that I was actually told to believe these things. They're things you just sort of pick up. I think in our culture, we kind of gloss over faith many times. And we make it seem like, if you do everything right, God will bless you. And if you follow him perfectly, and if you do, especially if you become a missionary, he will protect you from all harm. And there will, there will be these amazing stories to tell of how he brought you through miraculously. And I believe that God does that many times, but it's not always the case. And so as things began to happen, I realized that, if I'm honest with myself, being in the center of God's will may be the best place to be, but it is not the safest place to be. And when I looked back at missionaries down through the centuries who had been martyred, and even the early apostles and disciples, they were never promised safety and security and comfort in following Jesus. And Jesus said, take up your cross and follow me. And here in our culture, we wear nice shiny crosses on our neck, a piece of jewelry, but we've kind of lost the part about suffering and sacrifice and walking through adversity. And Jesus, the words he said were, he says, in this life, you will have trouble. And so I had to come to terms with that face to face, head on in my work as a missionary.
And it's not like the trouble of the standard American, this is not like, oh, I've got a little too much month for my money, or I've got too many bills, or I need to file bankruptcy. Even those things, which are terrible, like you dump a business, or you get fired from your favorite job, or you just get fired from a job, or the tragedies and traumas in our life are still tragedies and traumas, and they are, but it just feels like those don't prepare you for some of the things like political unrest and bombs and guns going off. And I know that there are parts of our cities where that's also true.
Sure.
I certainly don't want to seem naive about that. However, it's not choosing to live in that.
Right. And, it really hit home. My first term, I was living in a remote village, and I remember so many mothers were I'm a nurse, and so many mothers were bringing their babies to my clinic, and those babies would not make it. They were on death's door. And so one day I started kind of making a mental note. I would go around the village and I would talk to people, and I would ask women, how many children have you ever had? And how many are living today? And in a village of 3,000 people, the average mortality rate was 50%. Like 50% of these women, their children were dead. And we just can't fathom that in our culture. We have medical care, and babies do die, but it's rare. And to live in that kind of a culture where that's the expectation, that you're going to, when you get married and you have children, you're going to expect at least 50% of them to die, and you might die, and you won't get the medical care that you need. And so even just taking care of patients and watching them die was hard. And then, of course, myself and my own family and our colleagues, we all went through some pretty intense illnesses, and some of our colleagues almost lost their babies. So it's just a very startling way to wake up to that reality. Is like, okay, you go over there with all this excitement and zeal, and we're going to do great things. And then you're like hit every day with these hard things. And then you realize these people live this way. They live like this. We in America are in a sheltered, privileged position that we don't realize. And so you're right. I think the kinds of problems we have here, yes, we have problems. Everyone has problems, but we don't realize the advantages we have and the blessings we have.
Yeah, we definitely don't see those. I mean, you certainly don't hear about them on the news at all.
Right.
The other thing, which, I mean, of course, and what I'm about to say is going to seem pretty obvious, but fear, right? Just that day in and day out of just an uncertainty. And we're in certainly an uncertain time right now, right?
Sure.
So
Yeah.
Your whole life for 19 years was uncertain every single day, whether there was going to be food and running water and electricity. And I mean, just kind of what we would be like, what? Our water was turned off. The only reason our water gets turned off is because we don't pay a bill, right? Like, honestly, it's not like some random rolling water blackout kind of thing. Right. So this fear and being able to step into the fear and still figure it out and call it out for what it is, which is Satan's lies.
Yeah. Well, and I think, one of the things I talk about in the book that I really came to terms with was that, I struggled with my own fears, anxiety, depression throughout all of those years. And even before I went to Africa, I struggled a little bit with that. And, there's this belief in the Christian community, or there was, at least in the past, that if you struggle with anxiety, fear, depression, you're not a mature Christian, your faith is not, good enough, or that you should be happy and joyful and all those kind of things, which the Bible tells us to be. But then we have these emotions, and what do you do with them? And, I would be spending hours a day reading my Bible, praying, and just constantly practicing the presence of God. And yet I still struggled with anxiety and depression. And then, of course, when the PTSD started, after many of the traumas, it was just unavoidable. And the fact is, and this is something that I came to realize after lots of study and listening to different other authors, that there is a part of the curse that is anxiety. It's part of the curse and depression, and it's because we are not meant to be without God, and the Garden of Eden is what we were created for. And so here we are, cast out of that garden, and we're in this world, and we get to experience the side effects of the curse, the whole package deal. So when Adam and Eve ate of the tree of the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil, the fruit of the tree, they, along with that came the knowledge of good and evil, came anxiety, depression, and fear. And that's because, and so as long as we live in this world and it is still cursed and Jesus hasn't returned and it hasn't been restored to what it's supposed to be, there will continue to be anxiety and toil and pain in childbirth and suffering. And so when we come face to face with that, it's depressing. It is.
It can be, for sure.
And so I think I realized that some of my reactions were normal, because, you know, some of it is the autonomic nervous system. You know, PTSD scientifically has been shown to be these, you know, reactions, our flight, fight response, and then they get ingrained in the brain. And I think it's 30% of people who experience trauma will experience PTSD. And not everybody will. Why some people do and some people don't, it varies. And so, but I did. And then I had to struggle with, well, why? And, you know, of course, part of it was accepting that I'm human and that I have normal reactions. And missionaries are human. I think a lot of people put them up on a pedestal and say, oh man, they're doing these great things. And yes, they're very well trained and they're dedicated and they're, you know, they're committed and they do, you know, they're great people, but they're people. They're human.
Yeah, they
and
are.
So they
human.
have the same reactions. And so statistically now, a lot of the studies that I read about have shown that I think it's 49% of missionaries will return to their home country with some type of mental illness, including depression, anxiety, trauma, you know, PTSD. So that is a staggering number. And it just shows that missionaries are human. And I think it also points to something that I've, you know, reflected a lot on in our culture. I think it's our culture, missionaries from our culture or developed countries are kind of set up for failure. Because
absolutely, I was thinking that.
Our expectation is that everything we have this promise of the American dream and, you know, the picket fence and Cinderella stories, and we get that from a very young age. And when things don't go well or when we're stressed out, we have all these coping mechanisms, which may not be good, like, you know, binging on Netflix or going out and getting a margarita or whatever it is. Right. And so we block out the reality of the curse and the reality of what's going on. And we just we have a way to numb ourselves. And then most of the time, you know, our culture creates this environment where we have pretty much all our needs met. We don't struggle like our ancestors did just to get food on the table. Most of us don't. And granted, there are times, you know, you may lose your job but we have welfare or, you know, we have backup plans, and there are people in this world that don't have any of that. And so when you're thrown into that kind of a culture and you're forced to live the life that they live, it's a very shocking
safety net.
Yeah, it's very shocking, I think, for Americans in particular and other Westerners. So I think that's partly what happened to me. Not that Africans or people living in impoverished countries or war-torn countries don't also experience these things. But I know I was talking to a colleague I was in a training event several weeks ago, and one of the missionaries who also worked in Africa said that he noticed in the United States, when people go through difficult times, when Christians go through difficult times, they often pray that God would take away the suffering. And whereas his colleagues in Africa, when they were going through hard times, they would pray that God would help them endure the suffering. Because suffering in their mind was a given. And we don't want suffering. We don't want adversity in our life. We're trained to believe that it's bad, it's wrong. We need to reject it, run away from it. You know, even in our relationships, when people are difficult, oh, they're toxic, just ghost them. We don't need them. We run away from adversity. We block it out. We numb it. And yet I think God asks us to walk through it. And if we're tuned into him, we know, the scripture tells us that he walks through it with us.
Absolutely.
But if we're not paying attention to that, we won't feel his presence. We won't know that he's there. And I did struggle with that too. As I was going through a lot of my traumas, one in particular, at one point I felt that God had abandoned me, that I was somehow being punished. And that was really hard. It was a hard emotion to overcome. And, you had talked about how, sometimes we have shame or something that happened in our past that kind of plays in our mind when these things happen. And so that happened to me, I believe. I brought back some of my past shame from my childhood.
Absolutely.
And then I felt that shame in the moment, and it wasn't my fault, but yet I somehow felt that it was. And so I think we can go down these rabbit holes and spiral out of control. Our thoughts will spiral out of control.
You have said so much in the last 2 or 3 minutes, so I want to bring you back for just a second to this whole notion about Americans being very works based, and how we have this notion that if we do all the right things and we look for these scriptures that, oh, he'll give you your heart's desire, and you're like, okay, what do I need to do to get that? What does that mean? Does that mean that I'm going to get $1 million going to drop in my bank account? Like, what does that mean to people? But I think that setting ourselves up in this works based, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, very American dream-esque, right?
Yes.
Like, if I just do everything right, then there's not going to be suffering. There's not going to be failures. There's not going to be these things. They're not going to come because God loves me, number one, and I'm working my fanny off. So I'm doing what he said to do. And I mean, I can be certainly transparent. I've certainly said those things to him, like, I'm doing all the things.
Right. Why aren't you blessing me?
what am I not doing? What am I supposed to be doing? Help me understand where I'm supposed to go and how I'm supposed to keep going through what I feel like you're telling me I'm supposed to be doing. So what was it for you that you finally keyed into, that you knew you were still on the right path in spite of or despite all of the trauma and all of the illnesses? Oh my gosh. In her book, y'all, you have to know, like, you turn a page and she has a trauma, 3 pages later, she's sick. Like, it's not just the traumas that she went through, the war and some of the things that happened in that particular area of Africa, but it was also her own personal health journey that created a lot of trauma for you.
Yeah.
And just the lack of medical care.
I think
How do you make all that make sense?
I think what really started bringing it together was a counselor.
Okay.
We had a team of trauma counselors that work they're kind of they're the mobile member care team is what they're called. And they work for all different mission organizations responding to trauma and helping missionaries by providing biblical counseling. But the neat thing about these counselors is that they've also been through trauma in many of the same parts of the world we were in. And so that meant a lot to me. So one of these counselors came to our field and offered his services to us. And I sat down and started talking about some things that I was struggling with. And it led to this 2-hour session where I went over everything I could possibly remember. And he goes, no wonder you're messed up, and you're okay. And that's normal. And it was like, oh, I'm normal. Okay. I'm okay. And I felt like, early on when in my missionary career, I felt like I was wrong for feeling these things. And now he's telling me that I'm normal. And then he started telling me his story. I'm like, wow. Okay, then I trust you with my story. And so it was it was just so beneficial to me to get that counseling. And then one day my husband, we were still in the capital city where the counselor had come, and my husband was getting really snappy with the kids, and it was so uncharacteristic of him. And I said, you need to go see this guy. And he went, and then he came out and he was floored. He's like, I feel so much better, because we were carrying around this burden, and and we just didn't know what to do with it. And then he helped us a lot. And then he gave us, like I said, biblical counseling, a biblical counseling response. And a lot of the books that he recommended to us were also very helpful. I talk about them in the book. Just seeing that, trying to change my perspective. I think I had to redefine who God was.
I love that part of your story too. In the beginning, you wrote, let me see if I can find this. You wrote that navigating fear, understanding the whys of the universe, and finding purpose and meaning in this life are the private mission of every member of humanity. And I wrote above that, I'm not really sure that that's true, only because I don't think that people really want to look at that. I think they want this distraction, and they are pulled to, they're pulled to all of the distractions that are, whether it's, for me, like a lot of my people, it's food and poor lifestyle, but it can be porn, like my friend Sophia Sam, or it can be traumas and just health things that distract you from and like color the lens of how you see God, right?
Right. And I think that, even those things that people turn to in a way are a search for answers, like the meaning. Where can I find meaning? Where can I find fulfillment in this life? And too often we turn to the wrong things. But I think deep down inside, there's that yearning, that God-shaped hole that we have to fill, even if it's subconsciously, we're looking to fill it, and God can only he can fill it. And yet, like you said, we fill it with everything else, because everything else is right there. We try, and they all come out wanting.
Yeah, the hole never really feels full. In my own life, in my own story, and pieces and parts come out all the time. It's the same thing until I slowed down, right? This slowing down the pace of my life, which you also love that part of Africa.
Yes, I
was
did.
just the slowness of the pace, until I came to a screeching halt. And then still had like a couple gears to gear down more, right? Without backing up. But
I think it's hard.
It's so difficult because, and it's like what we were talking about, just to bring it all together, it's that we hustle and grind, and that's part of the distraction.
Yeah. Well, I do share about how early on, before I went to Africa, I had the opportunity to go on a mission trip to New Guinea in the South Pacific. And I was, taken up to this remote village up in the mountains in a swamp area. And it was like, it was so remote. It was like Stone Age people. And I sat there and, for like 2 weeks had to bond with the people in the village and try to learn their language and spend all my day with the ladies. And they would take me fishing in the river, and then we'd sit there weaving baskets. And I remember sitting there with these women, and I could hardly communicate at all, but yet there was this understanding and this communication, and they were showing me with their hands how to weave these baskets. And I'm like, I don't even remember where I came from. All I know is this moment, and it's so peaceful and it's so meaningful. And like then, a few hours later, the missionary we were visiting had the radio on, and they were announcing the Olympics way far on the other side of the planet. And I remembered, oh yeah, that's what the rest of the world is doing. And I could care less. I could care less, because in that moment, it was all that was gone, all that distraction was gone. And it was just such a beautiful thing to not have all that in my life. And I think it was that really what drew me to this lifestyle of being a missionary. Of course, when we got to Africa, it was a little different. And there were, of course, moments that were like that were just very quiet and peaceful. Moments when I could sit down with the ladies and talk and make friendships and, sell bananas on the side of the road. It was just simple things. And
that's your next book, is The Peaceful Time.
To write The Peaceful Side.
This book, y'all, has nothing to do with that. You do mention it, just to be fair, but it is definitely not the theme through there.
Right.
The theme is definitely much more what you endured, and the fact that you didn't really feel prepared for that. And I think that that's so fair. And particularly you were young when you went.
Yeah, I arrived on the field, I believe I was 25.
Yeah, it's very, very young, very young.
And I left when I was 44. So it was a lot of my years were there.
Those definitely formative years, right? Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, I love our conversation. Tell me from now that you're home, the last third or so of the book, y'all, are the amazing lessons that she learned out of all of this. And for me, a lot of those things hit home, particularly just slowing down and looking at what's around me and paying attention to those things, along with understanding that the traumas and the situations that I've been through, different than yours, but they've led me down a new path of being able to help the person that I used to be. And I think that that's something that where you are now. You just told me a story that just happened recently. Do you want to share some of those things?
Sure. Yeah. Well, I mean, in general, we came back to the States in 2009, and I had to get a job. I was a nurse, so I worked in an emergency department, and worked in various nursing roles since then. And I was pretty burned out, and pretty just, I don't know, bitter, maybe even. And I think that's a natural thing for a lot of people when they come back after trauma, is just you're processing it all. We needed to get away. We needed to have rest from all of that. And so I'm back to work, just trying to get back into the groove of living in the United States, and started working as a nurse and taking care of patients. And I was floored at how many people struggled with some of the same things that I struggled with. And I never really saw that before. But here I was, after having gone through all that in Africa, suddenly I could see my patients with a different level of empathy. And I just connected with people I never would have dreamed I would have connected with, hardcore criminals, people being drug off to jail for abusing their wives. And, just why was I drawn to these people? But I could see in them hurt, and a lot of them were traumatized. World War II veterans. I even met an Auschwitz survivor once, and it was like, wow, these people, we have something in common. And even sometimes it was just be a little old lady who never had anything bad happen in her life, really staggeringly, but just this sad life she lived. And she was sad and she was depressed. And so, yeah, I felt that before. I know what that feels like. So just having the opportunity to see people and meet them in their need, and try to be a glimmer of hope for them, and show them that there was a way through the experiences they're having right now, those emotions. And so God really worked, a miracle through that for me, because that was part of my own healing, was to see that he could use the worst things for the good, to help other people. Yeah.
Absolutely. And it sometimes becomes cliche and trite to say, oh, it's all going to be for the good. God works everything, right?
Right.
To the point where you kind of want to like, ugh, if anybody says
Really?
that to me one more time,
Right.
right? You kind of like, ugh, it's so awful to say that. But at the same time,
Yeah.
when you can really step in and be humble and not have to be
Yeah.
right about the situation and be the victim, right?
Right. Right.
We
And
victimize
yes.
ourselves then, and we don't want to see the good.
Right. And I really, I determined at one point, I did not want to be a victim of my own life. I wanted some meaning and purpose in it. And, you know, I look back at what I went through as a type of on the job training, you know,
Mm.
and I didn't see it happening. I couldn't see it for what it was at the time, but and I don't know, I don't know all the ins and outs and mysteries of how God works. I just know that the word, his word promises that he works all things out for the good of those who have called according to his purposes. And so as long as I align myself with his purpose, he will use me in a good way. So, and I have also learned not to um, fear the bad things that are coming. There's still probably bad things coming. And I know one of the lessons I learned from a dear friend on the mission field during actually two friends, during some really stressful events that we went through together. During one very scary attack, one of the missionaries I was with sang a hymn, and she just had that
Oh, I
hymn on the
remember that.
tip of her tongue and ready to sing. And then I was just caving into fear and panic. And she sang this hymn, and the rest of us in the vehicle just started singing with her. And it was like, wow, she has a plan. I have no plan but panic. And so now at this point in my life, I'm like, I need a plan. And so I work on that plan. I've devised a plan, and I prepare myself with God's word and songs and scripture and a mindset so that when the next bad thing happens, which I'm guessing it will because that's the way life is,
It's life.
um, that I'm ready and I'm not going to react in the same way. And it doesn't mean that I won't sometimes still feel afraid, but it'll give me a plan to do the right thing in spite of the fear. And
Oh,
then,
you
and
win.
yeah. And then another friend, we were in this terrible situation where there were bombs going off, and it was very close and it was very scary. And I was just freaking out. And I turned over to look at my friend, and what was she doing? She was gathering all the children in the neighborhood and gathering them in a circle and praying with them. And to me, that was just like, wow, she just had the presence of mind to do the right thing. And so it's like, I feel like now that's what I want to do. I want to be ready with a plan. I want to look, if I'm in a moment where everything is breaking loose, I've learned that the enemy wants to distract me with fear, anxiety, panic. And yes, I may still feel those things, but I need to be aware of what the enemy's trying to do. And then secondly, be aware of what is God doing here? What is an opportunity here that he's giving me? And what can I do in this moment that he wants me to do? What does he have for me to do in this moment of fear? Like she did. She was able to help someone else with their fear. And so that's my action plan now is I always want to be tuned in to what does God want me to do with this situation? And, that's where I think time and learning and maturity comes into play.
Mm-hmm.
With all the things you go through, you look back and you learn, and it's like, that's what I want to do. That's what I want to get from this. So,
Well, that's beautiful. And just that, I think that in those moments when life happens, right? When
mhm,
something comes along, and whether it was on the mission field for you, but even when you came back, right? There were
mhm,
things facing you that you had to face down. And
right.
instead of falling into that distraction rabbit hole, you created a safety net. And you said, like, you read God's word, you have, I know one of my things is I love listening to worship music on my walk.
Mm,
That's one of my
yeah,
favorite things to do.
right.
Actually, when I run, when I walk, I listen to podcasts, but it's a different structure, right? So, but like those are some of the things that I do to stay in a healthy mindset and to stay close to God. What are some of the things that you do? Read the word and go ahead.
Yeah. So I have spent a lot of time creating playlists based on different themes. I have one that's on peace. I have one that's on Through the Valley. It's called Through the Valley. I have another one that's on redemption and restoration. And so those playlists serve me well in those moments when I need that reminder. But they're also great tools I share with my friends. I share with people when they're having those same feelings, or when I have somebody who really feels lost and needs the Lord. And, here's a playlist for you. But the peace one is really my go-to when I'm feeling like I need to be in that mindset of just trusting God and surrendering to whatever he's wanting to do with me. And but taking the time to build that playlist, it took months and years. The other one took me 7 years to get it to where it's got so many good songs in it. And so it just keeps growing. And when I'm kind of melancholy and down, I play that one and it lifts my spirits. And so I
love that.
also
Where would we find your playlist, Karen?
they're on Spotify. I can share them with
Yay!
you. They're on Spotify.
So y'all just look her up. It's
Yeah.
Karen Bettison. You can find her playlist, right?
Yeah.
Like this
Okay.
is I want people to be able to walk away with something, right? Like
Yeah.
here's a tool for you to use in those moments, y'all, when you are feeling frazzled, right? Go
Yeah.
find Karen's Peace playlist and just breathe for a minute.
Yeah.
And it makes it so much easier to hear God's voice and what you're supposed to do next. And you can breathe in what she was talking about before, the autonomic nervous system. I call it the automatic nervous system, right? Fight or flight, rest and repair. And
Yeah.
we do a lot of fight flight in this country all the
Yeah.
time. Go ahead.
And I think that's true. I think, trying to be proactive rather than reactive. That's really the key there. So for years I was reactive. I wasn't expecting it. And when it happened, I panicked. And now I'm expecting it. And so I'm prepared. I have an action plan, a battle plan. And, always be prepared. The scriptures tell us to always be prepared to give a defense of your faith. That's another thing I try to do. Always be prepared by looking for opportunities, and always be prepared with that song or that playlist or those scriptures that remind you of God's truth and not the lies that the enemy is trying to tell you. So.
Absolutely. And I would be remiss if I didn't absolutely take a left turn for just a minute and talk about your health journey.
Yeah.
Because a lot of the people that I know will be listening, y'all will be listening because you want to understand that you can heal from horrifying gut issues. Like, y'all, she had malaria. None of you, I mean, unless you've been out there, you probably haven't had malaria. Like, that is one of the most destructive diseases on the planet.
Yeah.
And not great answers still to this day. Better,
Yeah.
but not great. And the gut stuff, the parasites and the gut stuff, like help people understand a little bit about what you went through and then how you ended up healing yourself. Tell that's a nice little story
So
there.
yeah, it's interesting because this is where we connect and we have a lot in common.
Yes.
Because as being a nurse, of course, health is really a big deal to me, health issues. But now that, of course, I've had many of them. But when I was in Africa, I had many, many cases of malaria. Many times I had dysentery. And those were probably the two big ones that we struggle with the most. Our family also struggled with boils from time to time.
Yeah, that's crazy. Like we don't even know what boils are.
Yeah, it's just it's awful. And we had colleagues who had hepatitis and just other bizarre things. There's yellow fever and just things we don't even consider here. So we had to, take a lot of vaccines, of course, but then there's also medications we had to take to try to prevent those illnesses, or when we got them, to treat them. And one of the things that I found out just really got me into natural healing. I'd been trained as a nurse in the United States and in the medical field and learned how to, practice medicine. And somewhere I had always gotten the idea that traditional medicine was quackery. And so we were in, it was my first term. I was still single, and there was another couple, and the husband had gotten hepatitis. I believe it would have had to have been hepatitis A. It was jaundice as all get out. No, there wasn't any medicine he could take. He just had to wait it out. And he was sick for weeks, and he got very, very ill. And we were all thinking, oh, he's going to have to evacuate. And then they had tried everything and nothing was working. And then one of their house workers, who was an African, came to them and said, you need to try this root and make some tea out of it and drink it. And so they did. They said, what could this hurt? We've tried everything else. There's nothing else to try. So he drank the tea, and the next morning he was all better. No jaundice, no swelling. He felt
Just
more
like
energized,
that,
just like that. And I'm like, okay, you just made a believer
where were
out of
you?
me. Where is this root? I've got to find out what it's called. I want it in my medicine cabinet. And so I started believing that there are definitely some herbs out there that work. And so then years later, we struggle with malaria, and the medicines we were taking, malaria had become resistant to it. And so I don't remember what year it was, maybe 2005, somewhere around there. The World Health Organization announced this new drug, which had started in China as an herb, artesunate, and it was revolutionizing malaria treatments around the world, to the point where malaria had become resistant to all the previous drugs everywhere in the world except, I think, Mexico. And this new drug was treating all the forms of malaria everywhere else. And so they mandated all health departments all across the world in these third world countries to use what they called artesunate, artemisinin combination therapies. So you had to have that as one of the drugs you used, and it would eradicate malaria. As soon as I got my hand on this stuff, I was floored. It worked so fast, and it all came from an herb in China. And so it's like, okay, there's something about this. And I really began to see how I believe that God has created a remedy for just about every illness somewhere on this planet in a plant form, in some kind of natural form. We just have to discover it. And, of course, now here I'm back in the States. I found out I had celiac disease, got to get rid of the wheat and all the food with gluten in it. And then, so I felt so much better. My gut healed tremendously after I went on a gluten-free diet. And then about 4 years ago, some tests came back. Actually, even before then, I started developing all these precancerous tumors in different parts of my body. So that was a wake-up
that was a
call.
while. That even happened while you were on the mission field,
happened
right?
while I was on the field. And but then 4 years ago, it was like, oh, there's this now and then this. And it was the wake-up call for me. And my husband, we both decided to, start eating organic, eating whole foods, stop eating processed foods, artificial dyes, artificial sweeteners, anything that's, not good for you. And so we just went on this really healthy diet. And then I started doing research on medicinal herbs. And we live on a farm, so I started growing some of them. Some of them grew naturally in our woods. I was surprised to find out. And so that's just sort of taken me on this new journey of finding natural healing remedies. And so I do have a Facebook group called Nutritional Healing. And that's a place where it's sort of a clearinghouse of information. When I find articles or videos, podcasts, anything that is about that topic, ways to heal illness naturally from mostly plant-based remedies, then I post it on there. So that's become
And I'll make sure that goes in the show notes, y'all, so that you can find her on Facebook. Because obviously I've been practicing functional medicine and chiropractic for 30 years. And, that's been my jam. I've had to figure out ways around medicine when what we call traditional here, right? Standard Western medicine here, it doesn't work.
Exactly.
And isn't an answer, or is so full of side effects that it's it's not feasible for
Right.
some individuals. And the like the prevalence of Lyme and chronic fatigue and some of these syndromes, fibromyalgia syndromes that don't have one answer,
Right.
right?
Right.
Drug for bug for drug, drug for bug, pill for an ill. Like
Yeah.
that's Western medicine. And you know as well as I do that it's multifactorial. Like,
And yeah, and I think we think in terms of medicine in our country as we treat the problem rather than prevent it in the first
well,
place,
that's for sure.
and a lot of the things that a lot of the illnesses we have here in the United States are related to lifestyle.
All
And
of
they
them.
don't exist in other countries very often because they just don't get to that level. They're dealing with malaria and amoebic dysentery. They don't ever worry about cancer and heart disease because they never live that long, and they don't eat processed food, and they're not overweight because they farm, and so
Right.
so much of it's related to our lifestyle. And so when my husband and I started reframing our thinking about, okay, let's just never get those diseases. Let's try to prevent them from ever happening by changing our lifestyle,
Exactly.
doing the things we can do. There are obviously things we have no control over, but the things we
Right.
do have control over, let's change those things.
Let's do those
And
things right.
yeah, so that's important for everyone, I think, we far too long, our culture has gone down this processed food route, and it's so bad
Yep.
for us.
Almost 100 years.
Yeah.
Seriously, it started in the 30s and 40s. That's
Yeah.
when it started. So it's been, it's 80, almost 100 years old now. And
Right.
now we understand the outcome. The
Yes.
outcome is 70% of Americans are overweight and obese. And that doesn't mean that God doesn't love you. And I am not here to
Right.
judge any of
Right.
that. That is not what I'm here to say. But the medical fact is that is not healthy. That is
It's not the
ultimately
best thing
not,
for us.
it's not the healthiest way to live.
Right.
Um, and I don't think it's I think that we can do better.
Yeah,
Like we can
certainly.
be better and do better, right?
Right. And I
Um,
think that, you had mentioned one time when I talked with you about the fact that our culture is very indulgent, and um, maybe as Christians, we need to face the reality that we suffer from a sin of gluttony. And I
yes, ma'am,
really,
that's my word.
I agree with that. I think that, it's not just in the way we eat, but it's the way we live. And there's nothing like living in a third world country to see that, to kind of look at yourself and say, wow, I'm extravagant. I spend a lot of money on these things that I don't even need. And then you talk about food, wow, these people don't even have something to eat for the day. They have one meal a day and it's rice with nothing on it. And I'm eating, candy bars and potato chips on top of my steak dinner. And like, where does, it's just overwhelmingly, the contrast is overwhelming. And something that we've really started thinking about is, okay, first of all, how much money do we spend on Christmas? Let's give that same amount to people who need food. And then I'm like, well, wait a minute. Then there's, what did I eat today? Maybe I could set some of that money aside and help somebody who needs food. And so then, it puts your gluttony in perspective. Like maybe I won't have a weight problem if I just focus on trying to meet the needs of other people who don't have anything, take my plenty and give it away. And that's a different mindset that, we don't go
No, we
there.
don't. We
We
definitely
don't
don't
go there.
embrace that. I heard a
No.
statistic the other day on a
Yeah.
podcast, and I'm gonna probably get the numbers wrong, so sorry. But the amount of money that we spend on Starbucks and ice cream
Yes.
it's like $325 billion. Like,
Wow.
what would literally solve the world's freshwater crisis?
Yeah. Oh
So,
yeah.
like,
I believe
okay,
it.
in 1 year, that's how much Starbucks and ice cream we eat. Literally, if we would stop doing that
Mm-hmm.
for 1 year, we could solve by what you
Mm-hmm.
just said. Like, you take that $30 a week that you spend on your Starbucks and send it
Mm-hmm.
to one of the water
Yeah.
organizations, right?
Right.
Instead. And by the end of the year, we will have solved the freshwater problem across the
Yeah.
planet.
which then
I
just
mean,
makes you realize, so we could solve a lot of problems in our world if we just were, reframed our
right,
thinking. But,
exactly.
it has to be, I know God wants us to do it from the heart. And that's something, learning to be generous, learning to be, live that way. It takes a
Right.
lot because I think
Yes, it's not because, oh, I'm going to give up my Starbucks and you're going to give me the desires of my heart, right? This is not a genie. This
no.
is not quid pro quo, right? Like it's like,
Yeah.
no, we're just going to do this because there are people in the world that actually don't have a water, let alone ultra filtered water
Right.
that we drink out of
Right.
our refrigerator.
Right.
Yeah. Oh, I have loved our conversation today, Karen. We're gonna have to do this again, I think, because we have so much more to talk about.
Mm-hmm.
Is there anything that you want to get out there? Is there something that you want to say that I have not touched on, maybe? And then we'll wrap up.
Well, I just reiterate some of the things I said, just really want to share with people that this world is broken. If you're feeling broken, remember that it's the world that's broken. We sometimes just have to reassign our, make sure our faith is focused on a God-centered life, not the things that we have maybe expected all our lives, that safety, security. We can't put our faith and trust in those things. But putting our faith and trust in God is where we're going to find the most peace. And learning to do that is a lifelong journey. It takes time, but, surrendering every day, it's not just, we're talking about all the health things too, but spiritually learning to surrender to what God has for us. And everybody's different. I know that too often we start wanting to be like somebody else. We put somebody else on a pedestal. We want our life to look like theirs. But God is taking us each through a unique journey, each with our
Mhm.
own struggles, each with our own trials. And instead of feeling like, wow, I wish my life was like her, she doesn't have any problems, or them, they have this or that I don't have. Remember that God has got you where he's got you for a reason. And he's teaching you lessons through your trials, but he's also opening doors of opportunity for you to be used in amazing ways by him if you stay tuned into his Holy Spirit and, staying connected to the vine, staying in Jesus is the vine, we are the branches, and keeping our eyes on Jesus. I told in the book a story of, Peter on the waves and the
Right.
storm where Jesus came to them in the storm. They were all on the boat. And this is a story everybody, I'm sure that's a Christian, knows this story. And Peter said, Lord, if it's you, command me to come to you on the water. And Jesus said, come. And so Peter started walking on the water. And as he walked on the water, he noticed the crashing waves around him and he began to sink. And so just remember, keep your eyes on Jesus and you won't sink. You may still have a storm around you. That storm doesn't always go away, but you won't sink if you keep your eyes on Jesus.
Oh, that's so beautiful. And you know what, you reminded me that we were going to talk a little bit about our identity and how you really shifted your identity and realized
Yes.
that really our identity must come through as um, seeking God's purpose in our life, as
Yeah.
opposed to trying to build our own kingdom that we
Mm-hmm.
think He wants us to build. And I've certainly blown up a couple of kingdoms recently that I built that I thought He wanted me to build. But
Yeah. Right. Yeah. And I think that that's something, from an early age, we're trained in high school to, by guidance counselors, pick a career. This is who you're going to be. What do you want to be when you grow up? I want to be a fireman. I want to be a policeman. So we form these ideas of what identity is in our roles. Or I want to be a mommy. I want to be a daddy or whatever.
our
And so
identity becomes
then
what we do,
what we
not
do
who we are.
and not who we are in Christ. And as Christians, we know that our identity is in Christ. And yet so many times we live our lives as if it's something else. And even myself, I got wrapped up in being a missionary. And when we stopped being missionaries, I struggled with my identity. Like, who was I now? What was I worth? What was I good for? And so I realized, and this again was with some really good counseling, Christian counseling, realized that my identity needs to be in Christ and Christ alone. And that identity can withstand any change in career, any illness, any trauma, any tragedy, any loss of a loved one, any change in my life that was unexpected. My identity is safe and secure. And so I think it's important for all of us to remember that. Too often when we lose a career, lose our ability to, like let's say we're in an accident, we can't walk again, or we have a stroke or whatever, we become depressed because we've lost a part of ourselves that we wrapped ourselves up too much in, or our confidence in. So that's important. That's a big one, I think.
That's beautiful. Yeah. So beautiful. Y'all, there are so many takeaways from this book. You need to go ahead and get I Will Fear No Evil by Karen Bettison. And I'm telling you, it is a page turner and lessons along the way. I have so many, well, you can see my tabs, but there are so many highlighted places. So thank you, Karen, for joining me here today. It was so much fun and so full of wisdom.
Thank you.
I love you. I love your book. I love our conversation. So I know that y'all are going to probably hear from her again because she has an awful lot to share and tell. And God has got her on in a new place where she gets to help all of y'all who've had a lot of trauma because she's been through trauma. Just like my hormonal and health journey, I get to help you through that. She can help you through some different things just based on her own unique, what she just said, unique experience that God has put her on the planet for. And God has something unique for you too. Amen. Absolutely. So thank you, Karen. Yes. Thank you so much. And bye, y'all. Love you.
Thanks.